Welcome to the CNES Roundtable discussion for the month of July 2023, where we explore the pressing environmental issues of our time. In today's discussion, we delve into the recent environmental crisis that unfolded in the bustling city of New York. This crisis was not a result of local factors, but rather an unforeseen consequence of the Canadian wildfires, which engulfed vast regions in smoke and ash. Join us as we uncover the impact of these wildfires on the air quality, health concerns, and the urgent need for global collaboration to address the escalating challenges of climate change. In early July this year, a series of wildfires ravaged several regions across Canada, casting a somber shadow that stretched far beyond the nation's borders. The wildfires, fueled by extreme heat waves and persistent droughts, emitted massive plumes of smoke that billowed into the atmosphere. As these plumes traversed great distances, they reached the northeastern parts of the United States, particularly affecting the city that never sleeps, New York. The arrival of the Canadian wildfire smoke in New York City brought about significant repercussions. The usually vibrant skyline became veiled in a hazy shroud, obscuring iconic landmarks such as the Statue of Liberty and the Empire State Building. The air quality rapidly deteriorated, prompting health warnings and triggering a surge in respiratory problems amongst residents. The impact of the smoke was not confined to visual impairment and compromised air quality alone. The particles suspended in the air posed several health risks, particularly for the vulnerable populations such as the elderly, children, and individuals with respiratory ailments. Hospitals and medical facilities experienced a surge in admissions as patients sought treatment for aggravated asthma, bronchitis, and other respiratory complications. The incident underscored the interconnected nature of our environment and the undeniable influence of climate change in our daily lives. While New York City is thousands of kilometers away from the wildfire's source, the transport of smoke and pollutants across vast distances highlights the urgency of addressing climate change as a global crisis. Join us as we navigate through the smokescreen of uncertainty and delve into the heart of the matter in the aftermath of the wildfires that brought Big Apple to its knees. To start off today's discussion, we'll start with the question of how did the recent pollution from Canadian wildfires in New York City serve as a wake-up call to the interconnectedness of environmental challenges across borders? In what ways did the pollution event shed light on the vulnerability of urban areas to distant environmental disruptions?
Right, so I'll go ahead with that. Interestingly, while I was going through the Canadian wildfires and the impact on New York City in particular, as you rightfully mentioned in your introduction, the mayor, Eric Adams, he mentioned that, this may be the first time we've experienced something like this of this magnitude. And then he made the statement that climate change is accelerating these conditions and we must continue to draw down emissions and improve air quality and build resiliency. Now, while that makes sense and while that is commendable, what was interesting to me was the fact that the mayor mentioned that this was like the first time they experienced something of this magnitude. And over here, we can kind of see the disconnect between the global north and the global south. Because as we saw in the last summits of COP27 and others and World Economic Forums, we saw that the repercussions of climate pollution of countries in the global north were directly affecting the countries in the global south. One great example of that could be the Pakistan floods, but that was barely given any recognition until recently. So while it is a tragedy in the sense that while the people of New York, especially the people who are vulnerable, they are going through something which is like tremendously, it is hazardous for them. But I think it does was like a great wake up call for them at the very same.
Right, I completely agree with you. Also, would you like to shed light on how the vulnerability of urban areas was more stark in context of this pollution event, in the context of distant environmental disruptions?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm not exactly going to the specifics of examples, but another thing that was that can be pointed when it came to like urban areas was again the kind of coverage that it got. So while one can definitely argue the fact that, with the intersolation with urban cities and urban centers, the pollution would be more and the effect would be more, because again, people are crowded towards the cities. And while there is more population, the effect would obviously be felt more. But at the same time, I personally feel that urban centers are highlighted more and the impact is highlighted more, again, because the people are living there and there is more coverage, because the people who are directly impacted are again there. But again, when it comes to like the vulnerable communities and people who are not living in these bustling metropolitan cities, I think the impact over there might also be there. But it again might not get the coverage or like the media that it really needs. So I mean that's my take on it.
Right. So, related to that note, we move on to our second question, which would be understanding the impact of the pollution and what kind of economic and social impact it had on NYC. So, would anybody like to take that up?
I'll go ahead. The Canadian wildfire pollution in New York City had several indirect consequences beyond just the immediate effects on the air quality. They had significant impacts on the local species, human health, the environment, and even the infrastructure. The fires, especially, can lead to local extinction of certain species, even uh, if events like this continue to happen, disrupt migratory patterns and communication abilities of birds and animals, and cause damage to ecosystems and biodiversity. Uh, Wildfires also pollute water resources, increase carbon dioxide emissions, and reduce carbon sinks, which are one of our main front forces against climate change right now. Economically, the event disrupted various sectors like transportation and aviation, communication, energy, and water. And the tourism industry and local economies have also suffered as visitors and local people were discouraged from outdoor activities. Socially, the pollution event had significant health implications. The smoke and pollutants worsened air quality, leading to respiratory issues and cardiovascular conditions as well. And this also highlighted the importance of public health preparedness and the need for vulnerable populations to take extra precautions.
Right. I agree with you. What are your views on the existing environmental injustices that are prevailing in context of the recent polluting event, like Archisha so rightly pointed out?
Uh, since the event is very new, I couldn't find any direct links between the exposure to pollution and environmental justice in general. But there has obviously environmental justice is a very important and complex and multifaceted issue, which can vary from one location to another. And it could indirectly contribute to discussions about equity in exposure to pollutions, but direct links is not something that I was able to find.
That's all
I
right.
wanted to add in something here.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying that now that the pollution has hit New York because of the Canadian wildfires, um, the very fact that we're talking about these environmental justice issues now and that it's taken us so long for us to even recognize these questions says something about the justice that can inherently be seen in environmental issues like these issues of pollution, the air quality, these wildfires, and land management techniques have been part of countries in Asia, developing countries all across the different continents for years now. But the fact that these issues um, have been placed at the forefront of global discussions now, just because this is affecting the citizens of New York, is something that has implications on other global political problems as well. Like we start talking about problems of war crimes and interference when the issues are Russia, Ukraine, whereas there wasn't as much discussion when um, similar situations took place in Israel, Palestine. So I think we can really question why we place importance on narratives when they affect certain hegemons in the world and not the other so-called developing countries.
Yeah, that's an interesting point of view. Would anybody else like to join in? All right, then moving on to the next question. Looking back at the response to the pollution event, what were the strengths and weaknesses of New York City's emergency management approach, and how can local authorities better anticipate and proactively address the risks associated with distant environmental events?
I'll go ahead with this one. New York City's emergency management approach during this pollution event had both strengths and weaknesses, as with any other event. The major strength was that the city's prompt communication included calling for news conferences, issuance of health advisories, recommending the use of masks and staying indoors to protect public health. This helped raise awareness and provide guidance to residents on how to mitigate the risks. Another great point was the coordination between different agencies and stakeholders involved in this response. The city collaborated with the public health departments, environmental agencies, and local community organizations to provide information and support to all affected communities. However, there was also weakness in this response, which is effectively communicating the risks to the public. The East Coast has never seen wildfires as a problem ever before. So some residents were not fully aware of the severity of the situation or the necessary precautions to take. Many stakeholders and experts proved that this was the first time they even considered smoke and wildfires ever being a problem on this side of the coast. Another weakness was the unequal distribution of resources and information. Vulnerable communities, particularly those with limited access to healthcare and socioeconomic resources, had faced additional challenges in protecting themselves from the pollution. An innovative solution would be to learn how to fight existing wildfires more effectively. There is this project which is in collaboration with NVIDIA and Lockheed Martin, where they have created a virtual environment to better stimulate wildfires under a variety of conditions. And then they partnered with federal and state forest services to try and give them access to really great data and predictions about the wildfires that they're actively fighting. We know that climate change is making wildfires worse, and so the biggest thing we can do is tackle that problem.
Right. So, moving on to the cause of these pollution events. As we all know, the cause is obviously the Canadian wildfires and the smoke that's been traveling towards the northeastern parts of United States. So that brings me to the next question, which is to what extent do the Canadian wildfires and subsequent pollution align with the broader patterns of climate change and its impact on wildfire occurrences? And what are the underlying factors contributing to the intensification of wildfires, and how can these be addressed at the global level? So just to like introduce the concept of heat domes, which are considered like the underlying cause of these unprecedented wildfires. So these are basically a phenomenon that are these are large areas of high atmospheric pressure that trap and intensify heat, often leading to extended periods of hot and dry weather conditions, which are optimum for catching and spreading of forest fires. And these prolonged heat waves increase the risk of wildfires by drying out the vegetation and creating favorable conditions for ignition and rapid fire spread. While wildfires can start in a variety of ways, how quickly they spread depends on how hot and dry the surrounding area is. So a lot of experts have pointed out that the heat dome that emerged in July this year was one of the biggest heat domes in the history of Canada, and this wildfire is said to have razed down more acres of forests than ever before. The frequency and intensity of the heat domes are strongly correlated with climate change and caused by human activities. This year, a number of high-end heat domes have contributed to the wildfire outbreaks across Canada, and experts are of the opinion that more seem to be on the horizon. Would anybody else like to join in?
Yeah, sure. I think just adding on to it, I was reading a few articles on it, and obviously to like avoid responsibility, a lot and like essentially people who do not believe in climate change, a lot of people attributed the fact that no, it was actually like a single incident or like poor forest management that led to the wildfire. When in reality, if you look at the statistics that are there, the number of wildfires are increasing daily. And again, if you look at the authorities in Canada itself, right, a lot of people have attributed climate change as the real cause. So I think it is like pretty safe to say that, it's not a single incident. And the fact that it keeps happening and has effect this huge is like, again, like you mentioned about the heat domes and like, again, the vapor pressure that has been building up. Again, all of these are like results of like climate change and they're not like single incidents that keep happening.
Right, I completely agree with you, and I feel like it's high time people wake up to the reality of climate change. Moving on to the next question. How can international collaboration and sharing of resources, expertise, and technology contribute to better wildfire management and prevention? And what policy measures and agreements are necessary at the national and international levels in the context of global North and South to address the global challenges posed by wildfires and climate change?
Hi, yeah, I think I can take this up. So international collaboration enhances wildfire management and prevention, and this can be done through sharing advanced technologies like satellite imagery, remote sensing, and weather monitoring, and much more. If we enhance our real-time detection and monitoring technology, we can help develop systems and put them in place to monitor places that are at risk for wildfires or situations and mitigate them before the damages get too far. Um, International collaboration is really important in this as it fosters knowledge sharing, better practices, and effective strategies for prevention, firefighting, and preparing the community. Resource mobilization is also a big part of international collaboration, as countries with surplus resources and other firefighting capabilities can provide monetary and other assistance to these regions fighting wildfires and facing these outbreaks and enhance their overall capacity. Research and development, of course, needs to be fostered. There needs to be more collaboration among scientists, researchers, both internationally and at a local level. And lastly, policies also need to be coordinated. So, keeping in mind the federal or unitary structure of the country, there needs to be a highly coordinated policy between the different state units, between the different government and statutory bodies. And wildfires are influenced by climate change to a large degree. So, um, and which we all know the frequency and intensity of climate change is increasing globally. So international collaboration on wildfire management can address mitigation and adaptation strategies. And for this, greenhouse gases need to be greenhouse gas emissions need to be managed, um, and sustainable land management needs to be promoted.
Right. Would anyone else like to add something? All right, then moving on to our next question. While I feel it's important to rely on new technological developments, I think people can also benefit from looking into the past and researching about the indigenous knowledge and traditional land management practices. So this brings to us to our sixth segment, which is how can traditional ecological knowledge and land management practices, particularly those of indigenous communities, contribute to wildfire prevention and management efforts?
Uh, there's one paper that I read recently by Lisa Korteweg and Jan Oakley. and the paper dealt with decolonizing eco-hero narratives. So basically, the paper talked about these two movies. One was Grizzly Bear, and the other was Into the Wild, I think, if I'm not wrong. And both these movies talked about a white male savior going into indigenous territories in Alaska and Northern America, and to a certain degree, co-inhabiting with the indigenous peoples there and learning how to coexist with the animals and with the environment, with the ecological factors, with the plants. And both of them ultimately befall their death. One in one movie, one is killed by a grizzly bear, and in the second one consumes a poisonous plant. The point of this was that when we talk about modern day settler colonies, a lot of times the management strategies that we have relating to the environment aren't really suited to those lands because they come from a very modern, technologically advancing perspective, which sometimes can interfere with the ecological balance. And that's why there has been a focus um, on creating a new land-focused educational narrative, focusing on indigenous practices and indigenous customs and talking to locals and really understanding from there how best to deal with the land that we've been given in this environment. And that's why I think it's really important to talk to the stakeholders in the environment and in the ecology before making policies and before creating other technological policies.
Right. This also bears a striking resemblance to America's rather high-handed treatment of India and its role in climate change policies. Like, how they constantly have this narrative that developing countries like India and China are significantly more responsible, so to say, for climate change, whereas we know for a fact that it is deeply embedded in our cultures, sustainability and like indigenous practices of our tribal communities. So maybe looking into those and like showing the mirror to America would be a good idea. Would anybody else like to add in something?
Yeah, I think just one interesting tidbit, if you will. If you look at the Paris Agreement that everyone, refers to as the main document and as like the main text that, all the countries should follow. If you kind of like a quick do a quick search, you would kind of like figure out the term water has not been mentioned once there. And I think that in itself clearly shows how exactly and how consultative the whole process is. And are the actual scientists really involved in like, making of these policies? So again, that's another thing to like, take into consideration.
Right, that's really interesting. Would anybody else like to add something before we move on to the next question? All right, then moving on to the last and final segment of today's discussion. How does environmental inequity intersect with other social and economic factors, further exacerbating the vulnerabilities faced by minority communities, especially people of color, during such disasters? And in what ways were existing inequalities such as access to healthcare, housing, and socioeconomic resources magnified by the pollution event?
Right, I can take this up, and I think this is one paper which I was reading with regard to this, and over there they had like explained how climate change essentially like increases the inequality. So first, obviously, as you mentioned, there exists already multidimensional inequality, whether that is your economic inequality, social inequality, political inequality. And so what that exactly leads to is essentially greater exposure to climate hazards. And after this greater exposure, there is greater susceptibility to damages, which are again caused by climate change and climate hazards. And also there is like a less ability to cope with and recover from the damages caused by the climate hazards. So when all these three things come together, we can obviously see that, there is a disproportionate loss of assets and income and greater inequality due to like climate change. And again, since there is again your disproportionate loss of assets and income, and there is like greater exposure, that again kind of increases your inequality. So in a way, it's kind of like a vicious cycle. And unless and until the rich and like people who are on like the higher spectrum of like, wealth, on level of like wealth, unless they step in and they kind of like help people, help reduce inequality, which we are not exactly seeing in the current scenario at all. But if there is actually something like that, only then can the cycle exactly be broken and the inequality can be reduced. I mean, one step that has been taken in the recent past, which is again your loss and damage fund, which is again in your COP27. But like even after like months of the agreement, there has been no implementation plan set forth. So we're not really sure if that is just one commitment that they've made or if they're actually going to follow through with it. So I think the people and especially the countries in the global north who have the wealth, who are the major contributors of it, really do need to step up and take initiative for the same.
Right. And also to add to that, I feel like everybody knows how notorious the American healthcare system is, like in context of the kind of medical expenses each person has to pay for even the most basic treatments. Like, I know for a fact that an average uninsured cost of an inhaler can range from around $80 to $500, and that's a bare necessity, and it has to be repeatedly used. And as a patient of asthma myself, this sort of really hits home, and it makes me feel for the asthma patients in America right now. And according to certain studies, it was also revealed that each American pays approximately an additional $2,500 in medical expenses each year as a result of air pollution from fossil fuels and climate change. And the air pollution costs the country more than 820 billion yearly and is responsible for an estimated 107,000 premature deaths. And that's a huge number if you consider their population and considering the fact that it's a first world country. Also, I think it's interesting to look at the total carbon footprint of the US healthcare industry. There was this research paper by Chung and Meltzer in 2019, which highlighted the enormous contribution that healthcare makes to the physical economy of a nation. And according to their findings, the healthcare sector accounts for about 8% of America's greenhouse gas emissions, and with contributions coming from both direct and indirect activities connected to the supply chains related to the healthcare sector, which is about 46 to 54%, and significant portions of the nation's air pollution emissions and effects, including acid rain, at about 12%, greenhouse gas emissions at about 10%, again, smog formation at about 10%, and air pollutants at about 9%. I think it's important to consider whether the healthcare industry is adding fuel to the fire or actually saving people from these diseases. Also, it's important to talk about the disproportionate impact to the minority communities such as Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics, and low-income communities. So there was a study by the University of Michigan that revealed that industries that choose the least expensive route while determining whether to establish hazardous waste sites, they disproportionately target minority and low-income neighborhoods. And due to the phenomena of redlining, the communities of color, particularly Black communities, have historically been clustered near industrial infrastructure and industrial zones. So I think it's important to look into the minority aspect of the pollution crisis. Would anybody else like to join in? All right, then I think we can wrap it up. Any final thoughts by anyone?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit that seeing, like the perspective of the other spheres as well, we can say that just focusing on this Canadian forest fire, we can see that it impacted the northeastern US states, cities, and like it impacted the employees and all the students and everything. And I totally agree with your point of like the medical industry in US is actually overpricing everything. And as per the research, it has definitely been like the annual medical expenses have been increased by around $3,000. And due to this air pollution, the research shows that it has the annual cost of the medical industry has increased by around $850 billion. And that is approximately equal to 3% of the country's economic output, which is a lot, considering that medical things should be a necessity for everyone. And wildfire smoke cost like around $125 billion an year, which is about 2% of the labor income. So it is impacting like everybody at a major scale. I think that's it.
Right, I totally agree with you. Is there anything else? Okay, I think we can wrap it up. This was a great discussion. Thank you all for joining in.
And yeah, I think I would also like to thank Ria for organizing the roundtable and like for giving us with these like wonderful questions. And again, I would just like to thank everyone for joining in for the roundtable too.